So when we think of the story of suicide, we tend to ask the question of how and why did this happen, and what is my place in this happening, right? So let's start with just some kind of basic facts, okay? So currently, suicide is the second leading cause of death worldwide for ages 15 to 29 and has taken over 800,000 lives in 2019. And that is before COVID, right? So the numbers have changed since this research was done. With every suicide death, research shows that there are about 6 to 60, and most likely more, loved ones that are left behind to grieve the loss. We call the loved ones of suicide death suicide loss survivors. What we have learned is that those who lose a loved one to suicide suffer in unique ways as compared to other forms of death. And other forms of death, such as natural causes, age, sickness, and so we're going to discuss those forms and those uniqueness. So what we want to look at specifically in this segment is how these elements apply to you specifically in your life. So what I want you to do is get your journal out, get your pen out, and as we go through the questions, we're going to explore some of the questions. Originally, I designed this to be done in group format, but what I want you to do is, as I ask the question, I want you to pause the video, or you can listen through all of the questions and then pause the video and go to your workbook, or you can pause the video and kind of just move along as if we are together, right? And spend some time reflecting on this question and how it and what it means to you. So, but let's continue a little more about grief. So in all grief, yearning after a loss is typical, okay? And it tends to subside over time. When it does not, this means that the mourner is in a form of complicated grief, okay? So this tends to be so for suicide loss survivors, as they may have many questions and confusions about what happened, why it happened, my role, my place, the world's role, the world's place, mental illness, and such things, right? And all of these questions get in, not just questions, but the narratives and places that we get stuck in, they get in the way of us then kind of integrating the loss, right? And so we have to face these questions, and we have to ask them and ask what they mean for us in order to move forward and integrate the loss in a way that is then healthy for us. So traumatic death, such as suicide, tends to be sudden, tends to be unexpected, and a lot of times it tends to be very violent. So this can leave the loved one, you, full of shock as well as bewilderment. And so what is one way that our body turns an experience into a traumatic experience? When it's shocking, when it's unexpected, when it's prolonged, when we just were, moving along with life, and then something happens, and our psychological house is just destroyed, right? And so if not processed through this experience, then it can turn into what we call as post-traumatic stress. And how we experience post-traumatic stress is through a myriad of symptoms, right? And those symptoms could be difficulty sleeping, flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, or just kind of loop of thoughts, loop of questions, anxiety, depression, and so on, right? And so with that said, this obviously gets in the way of us processing the experience, okay? So Let's take some time to explore the following questions in your journal. If you're doing this with maybe a family member or a friend, or maybe there's several of you who've lost a loved one to suicide and you're doing this with each other, right? What I would say is pause with each question, take some time to write it out, and then share it with each other, and then continue. So let's start. Let's start with kind of the first one. So, how do you perceive the intentionality of the death? Do you perceive it as a choice or like they were driven to it? This is an important question, and I want you to think about this. Think about, the difficulties of the question of why. Why did they do it? Why did this happen? Who's responsible, right? We tend to believe that all people want to live. So when a loved one takes their life, we have a hard time understanding who to blame, right? And in that case, a lot of times we often blame ourselves. So I want you to pause this video if you'd like and take some time to really discuss, think about, write down, and then discuss this question. How do you perceive the intentionality of death? Be honest with yourself, right? And see what comes up. Make those notes. Second question. The need to explain and make sense of the death. How have you been able to do this so far? How have you been able to explain the death of your loved one and make sense of the death of your loved one? So take some time and write this out. And just remember, there's no right and wrong. We want to know where you are at. We cannot change something unless we first measure where it is. So we cannot even change ourselves, our emotions, or how we're reacting to something until we face the truth of, well, what is the emotion? What are my thoughts, beliefs? What are my explanations and narratives for this thing? Once we name it, once we frame it, right, then we can go about and talk about how to change it in a way that will be more adaptive to our life moving forward. So now let's talk about suicide loss survivors tend to feel some form of guilt and or responsibility for the death. How has this been for you so far? Have you felt any form of guilt? Have you felt any form of responsibility? If not, then you can just like leave this question alone. Maybe it will come up for you another time. If so, name what is the guilt saying if you do feel guilt. What is the guilt telling you? What is the story it's telling you? And when you think of responsibility, name what you think you were responsible for as far as this death is concerned. Again, no judgment. We're just naming things. We want to see where you are at now. We will talk about how to change that in the following segments. There tends to be a lot of stigma and shame around suicide death, and loved ones tend to hide the fact that their lost one died of suicide. How has this experience been for you? Write it out. How has it felt for you during maybe the funeral of your loved one? Before the funeral, after the funeral? How does it feel right now to talk about how your loved one passed away? Survivors tend to feel a greater isolation and avoidance from loved ones or from the community because the loved one died of suicide. How has this been in your life? Now, research shows that this depends on our perceptions of suicide And so a lot of times we will project how we feel about the suicide onto the people around us. And a lot of times there will be a lot of shame and a lot of negative, unhelpful discussion about suicide. Be conscientious of this. And it also can come from the best of folks who want to say something helpful and it ends up being very much not helpful, okay? So studies confirm that those who lost a loved one to suicide tend to have increased suicidal thoughts and tendencies. I want to go be with my loved one. Where are they? What are they doing? And etc. How has this experience been for you? So this is a very vulnerable question and may open up some deep emotional experiences. So as I ask this question, if you feel activated or if you feel triggered, and if your activation level is, I like to think of scales from 0 to 10, 10 being very high and 0 being not at all. So if you're about like 6, 7 and higher, what I would say is work this specific question out with your therapist, okay? And or with loved ones. Try to have some support here. If you do not have a therapist, just a reminder, please refer to the resources on the PDF and do yourself a great favor and find yourself someone who is a clinical trauma specialist. This will greatly help you in establishing a good boundary and a good foundation here. So with that said, we shall end this segment 4.1 of segment 4, and I will see you for segment 4.2. Until then, what I would like for you to do is take some time to rest, take some time to sleep, to process, spend some time outside, talk to people who are regulating, who are loving, and make sure to, not rush this work as it could be very activating. Also, there are times that we want to rush this work to kind of speed it up, but when we do that, it will keep us more in our cognitive brains and it will not give us enough time to drop into our emotional states, which is really where the work must be done, okay? So keep taking your time, keep resting, and I will see you in the next segment.